Hello again. My name is Gabi Mutuba, and welcome to the Listening Threshold, where we bend the world to the sounds of our own voices. This is episode number 3, and this episode is themed Your Sound Reveals Your Style. Now, today's episode is going to be a little bit more relaxed, as I'm going to try to speak a little bit about the idea of style and the idea of individual sound. I have compiled a question today that will help us to kind of get into today's theme. Today's question is, how did you find your sound? I'm going to start this question by introducing a person, a mentor of mine, I'd say, um, who kind of changed the perception that I had when it came to style, right? Because I think through style, one is able to, get to the understanding of what personal sound is. Okay, so I was introduced to an African American composer by way of just reference, by way of just being in the spaces that I was. Um, he is an African American composer and conductor, and he's very famous for coining this idea that is known to be conduction. Yes, and his name is Butch Morris. So Butch Morris was a composer and a conductor. Like I said, he coined this idea of conduction. Conduction is very interesting because it was a unique way that he approached composition that incorporated some of the principles of jazz improvisation, and it made his compositional approach extremely unique. And I think it challenged a lot of at the time, a lot of classical composers and a lot of classical musicians because he asked of them, things that were outside of their comfort zones. So, yes, Butch Morris and the idea of conduction and how it relates to style. So, one of the very interesting ideas that kind of, spoke to me as I was studying Butch Morris and listening to, this idea of conduction was quite interesting that, his compositional approach was that he was saying that, notes are just musical symbols. A note on a page or, a picture or a reference to a sound. These are all just musical symbols that are given to the musician for the musician to interpret, right? Which leads us to the idea that anything that is written on a score is merely just a sonic representation of the note. It is the musician's job to bring that paper to life, to bring that note to life. And because of this, the let me say, the biggest emphasis of this process is the musician's auditory system. This becomes the most fundamental part of how to take a note, the representation of notation on a score or on a sheet of paper into music. That space, that gap, that fundamental gap is the musician's auditory system. And what Butch was trying to say also was that, the most important person within, that economy of music making between the composer, the conductor, and the composition itself, and of course the musician, is that of the musician, because the musician brings their auditory system into into the note in order for it to be produced, to be heard. So that was very interesting for me, because I think that for the first time it really emphasized how important knowing and understanding one's sound was, in order to contribute to, you know, to an ensemble or into making music or into a musical space, a musical economy. So yeah, that was one of the major shifts that I had in terms of how important it was for me to, understand how I came to sound in order to have a more genuine contribution to, um, to the canon of sound making, of music making, of jazz, or of any style that I thought I wanted to be a part of, any community I wanted to be a part of. It was very important for me to understand my own personal sound, how I came to sound, the aesthetic of my sound, how I registered different textures, how I understood what is a loud sound for me, a soft sound, depending on my upbringing, how I register, you know, um, how I register different timbres, depending on, my first encounter with that particular timbre. So it made me kind of see where the major work of an artist was. You know, it also allowed for me to see what was not important. So the difference between what was fundamental and what was important. Because of course, knowing music, understanding how to read music is very important. Understanding how to play your instrument is very important. But what is fundamental for, you know, by way of Butch Morris and his study was the awareness of oneself, the relationship of oneself with one's auditory system. That is so, so important, so fundamental to the makings of one sound. And I wouldn't even say it was the makings of one sound. It is how your sound is revealed to you, right? So that revelation becomes a way that one comes to sound, one understands sound, and it also becomes, um, it permeates through everything that you do, whatever style that you decide to embark on, whatever genre that you decide to embark on, whatever field of sound you decide to partake in, your auditory system permeates through everything because it is how you come to sound. And interestingly enough, this I think is how many people understand also the idea of style. Like I said, how do you find your sound? I think sometimes this question is interchangeable with how did you locate your style? So, style is your sound. Your sound is your style. Style is not something that happens after the fact, it happens in the beginning. It happens by way, like I said, by way that you encounter certain sounds through your upbringing. So this then becomes your style. This is actually, I think, the true definition of style. And I read actually, I wanted to read a passage of Susan Sontag. She's an incredible writer and thinker. And she also speaks about this idea of style that holds this kind of definition, that it is not, style is not something that happens, like I said, after the fact. Style is the sound. Style is the technique, style is the interpretation. And of course, what people, I guess, become fixated on is the form where an artist decides to enact their style. So the form, of course, would be, in this instance, if you're a musician, it would be genre, whether I decide to do jazz, I decide to do rock, I decide to do pop, I decide to do classical. That is just a form in which I temporarily, inhabit in order to um, display my style, for my style to kind of throw its weight around, within this form. But of course, form is limitation. Form has a beginning and an end, just like any genre, but form is not style. Style is your sound. I wanted to read from Susan Sontag's Against Interpretation and Other Essays, um, just a paragraph that really, speaks to this idea that one cannot separate oneself from one's style. And it reads, I'm reading from page 16, and this is under the chapter called Style. It reads, in fact, to talk about the style of a particular novel or poem at all as a style without implying whether one wishes to or not that style is merely decorative, accessory, is extremely hard. Merely by employing the notion, one is always bound to invoke, albeit implicitly, an antithesis between style and something else. Many critics appear not to realize this. They think themselves sufficiently protected by a theoretical disclaimer on the vulgar filtering off of style from content. All the while, their judgments continue to reinforce precisely what they are, in theory, eager to deny. So this was really, really interesting. If you read the entire chapter on style and how she comes to, this understanding that, critics, often speak about style as though, like she said, it's separate from content, that it is separate from one's point of view. Style is your point of view, especially as a musician. Um, You cannot, it's something that you can't switch off. It's something that happens whether you like it or not. Your style is something that does not require your consent in order to be enacted. It's something like it's like my partner and I were speaking about this morning. It's the unconscious. It can't be hidden. You know, whether you decide to, like I said, whether you decide to enact it in the realm of rock or in the realm of jazz, in the realm of pop, in the realm of indigenous music, even in the realm of folk music. Style is something that you cannot hide. You cannot hide the way that you came to sound. You cannot hide what influences that you have within your auditory system. It's something that happens, you know, outside of your consent. That is the best way I can explain that. So, like I was saying with when we started off with Butch Morris, and I think the most important how this information really empowers a musician, an artist, with their perspective is to say that your style is your contribution, is the best thing that you can do, is the best contribution that you can make, the most sincere, the most genuine, and the more clear that you are about your style and your sound, how you came to sound, is the more, I guess, powerful your contribution. The more honest you are about how you come to sound is the more fearless that we hear and perceive your sound. That is the fundamental nature of style and sound. So I guess a more practical question to follow that up is to ask oneself, how then do I become better acquainted with my style and my sound? What can I do in order to become more aware in terms of what your style is, what my style is? And this then goes back to the previous episode that we had of Just Create and what creating brings us into awareness of our outside. So, and remember when we spoke about the idea of marrying the outside with the inside, in that how we came to sound is our auditory system. It's already existing within us. Now, the musical notation or the symbols becomes an idealistic representation of the outside, of what we perceive. Now we need to find out what is happening on the inside and where it lives within us, where it is within um, our bodies, and to marry that, to align that, so that it does not just live within this ideological, framework, but then it is something that has made an impression, something that, has found itself within our own auditory imaginations. And the more clear that is, the more comfortable that you are with that is an indication as to the location of that particular sound, the reverberation of where that sound lives within our bodies. And like I said, there are many ways to tell when one is on the right path, when one is a bit off. We made an example vocal exercises. And I'd say that it should never hurt. This is an indication of whether that sound, that representative sound, is placed in the correct place within the body, within our own auditory, our own auditory systems. So sometimes you can hear or you perceive a sound to be, I guess, representative maybe on a score, and it's maybe a high F or something. And where it sits within the body, or where it sits, let's start first there, where it sits within the auditory or not the auditory imagination, where it sits within the conceptual framework is that perhaps your vocal teacher says to you, okay, this is an F, sing it in your head voice, for instance. And you sing it in your head voice, but something doesn't sit right within your throat, or something is uncomfortable in the body. And you realize that when you labor, when you keep laboring on that sound, you finally find that, oh my goodness, this F sounds better when I incorporate a little bit of my chest register, or that power that comes from my chest register. This is now that labor that you're doing as an artist, to marry the concept with your own auditory system. And your own auditory system, like we said in the beginning of this conversation, is the most fundamental, because this is where the true contribution of your sonic, of your sound comes from. This is the place where you can contribute. This is your work as a musician. This is your action. This is your contribution. And I think, when I'm saying this, I'm actually thinking also about the idea of AI, and perhaps when thinking about the limitations of AI as opposed to, one's the contribution of persons, I should put it this way, right? This could also be, this is the differentiating factor, this auditory system. Like I say, so AI could easily, represent a conceptual idea. It speaks to the conceptual idea, but the work of the artist, the work of the person, is the work of that comes from more of this, experiential place. And this is where, the nuance lives and exists. This is the style, by which only you can have clear permission into. Only you can, because only you have lived that experience. So only you have real access to the nuance and to the experiences, the small minute details of how you come to sound. And this is your contribution, this is your style, like I said, to a musical vocabulary. I always say this to my students. They, some of the girls that I teach are always, very apprehensive to sing like in the low register, in the low range. And they just say to me, oh, Gabby, I can't, I don't have a good low range, because it doesn't come out the way that I hear it the way it's supposed to come out, this idea of supposed to. And I say that no, there is a way that you can contribute to, the aesthetic of the low register in the way that you come to sound. Now, within your limitations, within your own auditory system, within your own mechanical, limitations of your voice. If that low register to you comes by way with a little bit of breath, with the low register, or a little bit of silence, you're adding to the canon of low registers and their interpretations through the female body, through the woman body. The interpretation is not one of that lives within the mechanical, that lives within this, like I said, this idealistic representation of that particular sound, but it comes by way through your experience, through your story. Is the beauty, is the true kind of a contribution that one can make to the collective, in order to kind of just expand, different representations of sound and of taste, of experience, of aesthetic that is possible within our individual experiences. Yes, last question. Last question around style, that I think I'd like to riff off this idea that this is the idea, this is the work of the artist, and to speak to it, beyond the borders of singing into, into the realm of the instrumentalist, into all instruments. This is the work of the artist. This, this covenant between the outside and the inside, by way of any instrument, whether you're a singer, whether you play trumpet, whether you're a bassist, whether you're a cellist, whether you play the clarinet, whatever instrument that you've decided to take on, there is the importance which Butch Morris has indicated, the technical importance. So the idea of knowing how to read, knowing how to interpret a symbol or a musical representation in the form of maybe a score or a picture. And of course, the second important factor, knowing how to play the instrument, so knowing how to make sound on the instrument of your choice. However, remember Butch Morris said the most fundamental part, not said, but gestured toward, the most fundamental part of that interaction is one's auditory system. The major work is how self-aware that we are of our sonic experience, of how we come to sound, in order to use the mechanics of the instrument, in order to use how we interpret, how we read, into producing the sound that we want to produce. The most fundamental part is how you come to that auditory system, is how you honor that auditory system through any kind of sonic instrumentation that you've decided to use. I think I'll leave it there today. It's been a great conversation. Do engage with me in the comments, asking any questions, any follow-up questions. I will try to add them to the questions that I have for the day in responding to any of the questions that I think are in relation to any of the themes that we've been talking about. So that is it for me. My name is Gabi Muduba, and you have been listening to The Listening Threshold, where we bend the world to the sounds of our own voices. See you next time. Peace and love.